Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute most fascinating, kind of counterintuitive moves in the entire history of the internet. We're talking about a silent war that literally impacts the apps you use every single day. Just imagine this. You have an unassailable technological advantage over every single competitor you face, and then you just give it away, for free. So who actually wins when you pull a stunt like that? Well, let's look at the numbers.
2 billion. I want you to really think about that number for a second. Every single week, deep inside Google's data centers, more than 2 billion isolated software environments are born and then destroyed. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 3,300 of them popping into existence, doing their job, and vanishing completely. Every single second. And the crazy thing, for almost a decade, the rest of the tech industry had absolutely no idea this was even happening. Google was fighting this invisible infrastructure war, and they had already won it, entirely in secret.
Section 1. Google's best-kept secret. To really understand what Google ended up giving away, we kind of have to go back and look at what they were dealing with in the early 2000s. See, Google had this problem that basically no other company on Earth faced at the time. They were just too big. Think about the massive scale of search, Gmail, Maps, YouTube. All of this had to run across hundreds of thousands of jobs, spread over tens of thousands of physical machines. I mean, no human could possibly manage that, right? No giant spreadsheet was going to track it. So their solution was this highly classified internal system called Borg. Borg acted like a literal hive mind. It would take an application, automatically find a machine to run it on, and constantly monitor it. And if that machine just suddenly died in the middle of the night, Borg would quietly resurrect the application somewhere else before anyone even noticed. Zero human intervention. No pagers going off, no middle-of-the-night panic. Named, somewhat ominously, after the Star Trek collective that just absorbs everything in its path, Borg was Google's absolute crown jewel. They didn't license it, they didn't sell it, it was their ultimate, unassailable infrastructure advantage.
Section 2. The container revolution begins.
So how exactly did this massive, highly guarded secret get out? Well, surprisingly, it didn't actually start with Google. Let's shift gears from the giant monolithic corporation to a plucky startup disruptor entering the scene back in 2013. In March of that year, a French engineer named Solomon Hykes got up on stage at a developer conference. Now, his startup was actually failing at the time, but he had this little internal tool he called Docker. Docker was incredible because it allowed you to package up an application into a single, portable, self-contained unit, a container, that could run unchanged absolutely anywhere. Now, the underlying technology for this had actually existed for years, but Docker made it incredibly easy to use. Almost overnight, Docker became the people's hero. It essentially took the magic that Google had been hoarding for a decade and handed it directly to everyday engineers, totally for free. The whole world suddenly caught on and just became obsessed with containers.
But of course there was a catch. Docker provided the engine. It was fantastic if you just needed to build and run a single container, but what happens when you have thousands of them? Who decides where they all go? Who automatically restarts them when they crash? Who scales them all up when a massive traffic spike hits on Black Friday? Docker had handed the world this incredibly powerful engine, but Google still held the keys to the fleet driver, Borg, which, remember, they had built a full 10 years earlier. Docker had essentially lit a massive fire that it just couldn't control. And inside Google, a few engineers suddenly realized they were sitting on the only bucket of water in the entire building.
Section 3. The unthinkable corporate gamble.
And this brings us to a massive turning point. Those engineers at Google wanted to take everything they had learned from Borg, rebuild it completely out in the open, and just give it to the world. They were about to pitch a truly unthinkable corporate move. These engineers, Joe Beda, Brendan Burns, and Craig McLuckie, walked into a room full of Google's most senior leaders and pitched giving away their ultimate secret weapon. The response? You're crazy. And honestly, you really can understand why. To leadership, this sounded like corporate suicide. Why on earth would you take your one massive hidden advantage, build a shiny new external version of it, and literally hand it over to your biggest rivals, Amazon and Microsoft? Unsurprisingly, the pitch was rejected. Then they pitched it again, rejected again.
But here is the cold, calculated strategy that finally turned the tide. And incredibly, this didn't even happen in a boardroom. It happened on a bus ride after a company offsite, where Craig McLuckie ended up sitting right next to a legendary Google VP, Eric Brewer. With a captive audience on this bus, McLuckie laid out these 4 brilliant steps. Step 1, look at Amazon Web Services. AWS was completely running away with the cloud market, and their lead was looking unassailable. Customers were totally locked in. Step 2, but if Google open-sourced their own superior infrastructure and turned it into a neutral commodity, it would completely change the game. Step 3, suddenly, customer applications would no longer be chained to Amazon. They could move freely between different clouds. And step 4, if those customers could move freely, Google actually had a fighting chance to win them over. This was absolutely not charity. It was a desperate, brilliant, calculated chess move.
Section 4. The Orchestrator Wars.
The executives finally agreed. The massive bet was placed, and Google prepared to unleash its Trojan horse on the entire tech industry. Now, obviously, they couldn't just call it Borg. Internally, they gave the project the code name 7 of 9, named after the Star Trek character who was a Borg drone but actually broke free. You know, a friendly Borg. But publicly, they named it Kubernetes, which is actually the Greek word for helmsman, the person who steers the ship. Even the logo they designed, a ship's steering wheel, specifically has 7 spokes as a subtle little wink to its origins. And they unveiled Kubernetes very gently. They didn't position it as a Docker killer. Instead, they presented it as a polite, helpful partner just arriving to help steer Docker's ships. But man, the conflict escalated rapidly. Let's look at the timeline. In 2013, Docker launches and democratizes containers for everyone. Then, in June 2014, Google ambushes Docker's very own moment of triumph, the first DockerCon, by announcing Kubernetes. This officially ticked off what the industry came to call the Orchestrator Wars. Suddenly, everybody wanted to be the one commanding the containers. Docker released Swarm. Other companies released tools like Mesos. Every tech kingdom out there showed up trying to claim the throne. But by 2017, the war was already over. The rivals basically surrendered, and Kubernetes had established total, undisputed dominance.
So why did Kubernetes win so decisively? A lot of people actually thought Docker's tools were friendlier and simpler to use, but Kubernetes had a secret weapon, something insiders often referred to as the last page of the board paper. See, while all their competitors were out there building features from scratch and making rookie mistakes, Kubernetes came pre-packaged with all the hard lessons, the weird edge cases, and the painful mistakes that Google had already made and solved a decade prior in total privacy. Kubernetes wasn't just some new code. It was literally 10 years of operational scar tissue, just given away for free. And then, right at the absolute height of its momentum, Google did something genius. They gave it away a second time. They donated Kubernetes to a newly created vendor-neutral home under the Linux Foundation called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Why did that? Well, because if Google retained ownership of it, competitors like Amazon and Microsoft would rightfully be terrified of it and just refuse to use it. By placing it in neutral territory, Google completely removed that fear. It allowed AWS, Microsoft, and Red Hat to safely and confidently adopt it into their own systems. Because it turns out, you don't win a standard by owning it. You win it by making everybody else comfortable enough to depend on it.
Section 5. Who actually won?
So, Google successfully set the industry standard. They managed to break Amazon's absolute lock-in. But as the dust finally settles on this massive strategic gamble, we really have to ask a deeply ironic question. Who actually won here? Well, operationally speaking, there is zero debate. An astonishing 80%. That's 4 out of 5 companies running containers today use Kubernetes. It is a total, staggering operational victory. It is literally running underneath most of the internet you interact with today.
But financially and strategically, the cruel twists of fate here are just wild. Let's break down the key players. First, you have Docker. They literally started the revolution, but they just couldn't figure out how to monetize it. And in an incredibly cruel twist, Kubernetes eventually grew so dominant that it actually deprecated Docker as its underlying engine. The company that lit the fire was basically written right out of its own story. Okay, what about the creators of Kubernetes? Instead of staying at Google, they eventually left. They started their own companies, had massive exits, like a $550 million buyout, or they went to work directly for Microsoft, essentially building Google's own weapon for the enemy. And what about Google? Well, they gave away their absolute crown jewel just to break the cloud monopoly, and today, they still sit in third place behind Amazon and Microsoft. Think about that. Google basically built the road, but Amazon and Microsoft are the ones collecting the tolls.
Now, to be fair, we do have to ask, was third place really a defeat, or was it a desperate rescue? There is a very real, highly nuanced argument here that without taking this massive gamble, Google Cloud might not have survived Amazon's early monopoly at all. By forcing the entire industry to adopt an open standard, they ensured that they at least stayed in the game. Sure, it might not have been the total sweeping victory the original pitch deck promised, but it was absolutely a desperate and necessary rescue mission.
Which brings us to the ultimate, somewhat strange lesson of this entire tech industry saga, perfectly captured right here. The fastest way to lose control of something is to win with it.
Google's biggest secret escaped. It became so universal, so ordinary, and so heavily relied upon by their own biggest competitors that it really isn't theirs anymore. It belongs to the world now. And it leaves us with this to ponder. When you create a universal standard that completely reshapes the entire internet,